Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Social Critic. My name is Sohail Shakiri, and today it is my honor and pleasure to be interviewing Mr. Doug Jacobs. It's a great privilege to have Doug with us today, and we'll be talking about the life of Bucky Fuller and Doug's wonderful play on the life and teachings of Bucky Fuller. And so I'll get right into it, give you a little background about Mr. Doug Jacobs, and then we'll jump right in. Doug Jacobs is a playwright, director, actor, and poet. Through high school, he studied science and math. At UC Santa Barbara, he was studying political geography when he saw Bucky Fuller speak several times on campus. By some twist of fate, he was also rowing crew, taking his first acting class, and performing in a play. 30 years later, he found himself writing Our Buckminster Fuller, The History and Mystery of the Universe, a play drawn from the life, work, and writings of Bucky Fuller. This play has had over 1,000 performances in Southern California, San Francisco, Chicago, Ventura, California, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle, Napa, Scottsdale, Santa Fe, Boston, Cambridge, Washington, D.C., Asheville, North Carolina, SIU Carbondale, and Edwardsville, where Bucky taught in the 1960s, in addition to Atlanta, Montreal, and in both Krakow and in Wrocław, Poland. 8 actors have played the role of Bucky. Mr. Doug Jacobs has lectured on Buckminster Fuller at Wrocław University of Science and Technology in Poland, and Mr. Doug Jacobs lives in Highland Park in Los Angeles, where he co-founded Teatro Arroyo Theater Stream, a performance wing of the Arroyo Arts Collective. Early in his career, he founded San Diego Repertory Theater with Sam Woodhouse, where he served as artistic director for 20 years. Hi, Doug. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Great. Yeah, well, we'll jump right into it. I was wondering if you could first tell me a little about, and you touched on this in your bio, but maybe you could explain a little bit more about how you got interested into the work of Buckminster Fuller.
Yeah, I didn't cover the main factor, which was my brother. My brother Steve Jacobs, who was an artist from when he was really young. Before he used to sit in my dad's lap when he was studying law school, and my dad would write notes in his books. And my brother grew up scribbling in every book in the house, and then that sort of turned into an artistic practice. And so from really before, from an extremely young age, before I was born, he was an artist. That sort of scribbling in books turned into art. And
Oh, wow.
and he was a big influence on me. And even there were very odd coincidences around all of this. He happened to he went to UC Santa Barbara in the Fine Arts School. Then he went to the Art Center School in Pasadena, which is one of the best schools in the country. And then they founded the College of Creative Studies at UC Santa Barbara, and they invited him back to join them for their first year. I just realized that was their first year. And Bucky Fuller was there in residence part of the time lecturing at the College of Creative Studies.
Oh, wow.
On the campus. And I was a freshman, and I was sort of just getting into theater. And my brother called me one day and he said, "You got to come listen to this guy talk." And I said, "Well, who is it?" And he said, "Well, Buckminster Fuller." And I said, "Who?" And then he repeated the name, and then it was, and then and then I said, well, what does he talk about? And he said, well, he talks about everything. You just have to come and listen. And then I said, well, I was rowing crew, going and meeting the van at 5 a.m. to go to the mountains to row in Lake Kachuma, and then we'd come down for classes that started at 8. And I was rehearsing a play, and I was going to class, and I said, and my brother said, well, come whenever you can. He talks all day. So I went there at around noon and saw the beginning of a lecture, went to a class, came back, he's still talking, went to dinner, came back, he was still talking.
My goodness.
Went to a rehearsal that got over about 10 at night, came back, he's still talking. And there are more and more people coming into the room and hanging in the windows. And there were very few people to begin with. And by the end, the room was packed. People were sitting on the floor. People were hanging in the windows. It was an old military barracks it was back to the 1940s to World War II. And so then I'd go back now and then and listen to him talk. And he did that for 2 weeks straight, talking 8, 10, 12 hours a day, which was not unusual. He gave these lectures at the London School of Economics that went something like 40 hours. There's a lecture online called the Everything I Know lectures, which are 42 hours long, which are free to watch online. And he would just talk endlessly, circling through the history of commerce or through geometrical structures and through different things. And so, oddly, I didn't declare a major in dramatic art until I was a junior. It was almost a year and a half, 2 years later when I actually went into theater. But I was doing shows all the time from that point on. And I was reading Bucky books, which were very hard to read because he had this unique language. I mean, once you got the trick of the language, they weren't hard at all. They were very simple, but they were, and then I kind of would keep setting him aside, not because I was busy with other things, and he would keep coming back at me. Like a lot of his books ended up on remainder tables in the 70s, late 70s and 80s. His books would go on sale very cheap in bookstores, and I would buy them when I'd see them. And then somebody gave me, I think, or maybe I bought it, but I think somebody might have given me a book called Critical Path, and it's the one book that never went out of print. And that really I went even deeper down the rabbit hole with that book, because it goes into the design elements, but it also goes into his sense of history and commerce and all of that. And then jump about another 10 years, and a man named Peter Meisen walked into my office at the San Diego Repertory Theater, which was in my bio, and he wanted to rent the theater for the opening night of Bucky's 100-year anniversary of his birth, which was 1995. And I said the theater was booked, but then he found out I was really interested in Bucky's ideas, so he drafted me to direct the opening night. And he handed me a book that was by Bucky's son-in-law, Robert Snyder, who was a film director of documentaries. And it was called The Monologue Scenario. And I suddenly began to get the idea that maybe this would make a play. And
wow.
And through that, I met his daughter, and that confirmed I can talk about that a little later, about how that confirmed that writing a play was a good idea. And that was, when I met her, it was like 25 years ago this week. So the coincidences kind of continue to pile on. Someday he'd be 125 years old. He was still alive.
Amazing. Wow, the synchronicities.
The framework of how my life keeps going into and out of Bucky's work. And there's so many ways he's sort of affected my work, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah, well, actually, yeah, that's actually a great segue. I was wondering if you could tell us a little about why you feel his work is so important, and also, how that's played into your own work.
Well, when I saw him lecture, it was 1968, when the whole world was kind of exploding in riots and violence and police violence and soldiers.
And so this is
student
the time
riots
of,
in Mexico City and Paris and Santa Barbara, where I was going later in the year. There were riots in Santa Barbara. And the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968 blew up into demonstrations and what many people called police riots. The police just tore into the demonstrators. And there was a
wow.
lot of frustration and anger from all sides. And so I think we're in
Was it because of, I'm sorry, was it because of the Vietnam War?
Yes, it was the Vietnam War, and that year, earlier in that year, just weeks before I saw Bucky speak, and weeks after, Martin Luther King was assassinated around the time of the spring break. I think it was early April, and 2 months later, Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and he was campaigning against about ending the war in Vietnam, and
Oh, wow.
and he was assassinated in Los Angeles right after he'd sort of wrapped up the nomination because he won the California primaries.
Oh, wow.
He was shot going out of the hall, and he was in the kitchen. And I just found out a few years ago that, because I remember seeing him speak at Santa Barbara, and he spoke at Santa Barbara the day before he was killed. So these were explosive times. And Bucky was like your grandfather, sort of saying, you know, we can work through this, and your own individual imagination is very key to solving the biggest problems in the world. Because he felt a lot of the institutions were boxed in and couldn't really tackle the biggest problem. But when individuals came up with solutions, people would begin to fall in line behind the creative imagination of individuals. Now, he didn't believe it was individuals versus the group. He really felt the individual at his best served the good of the whole group. But the individual had to work from their own thinking, their own feelings, which he found even more primary than thinking, and that feelings are really absolutely unique to each of us. We have our own feelings. We borrow thoughts and thinking from others, but our feelings are our own. And he felt you had to really pay attention to those. He didn't believe joining parties was a great thing because they made people think the same.
You mean
And
like
so,
political parties?
yeah, political parties or any group. He thought groups should form through natural associations of people who were sharing common goals, but that very often there's so much uniqueness to the way individuals feel that they're often pressed into one way of thinking. So at that time, there were Democrats, there were Republicans, there was the right, there was the left, there were religious people and anti-religious people. And Bucky kind of did not speak along those lines of division. He spoke through a whole different systematic thinking that integrated everything. And so people from the right and the left were often fascinated by his ideas because they had such integrity and structural truth that there were there would be conservative economists who were fascinated by his ideas. There were left-wing dropouts who loved his ideas. He had a huge impact on the computer industry. And so he definitely did not think along the lines, oh, it's the freedom of the individual or it's the good of the group. He really believed those were two sides of the same coin. And he wasn't an either or thinker. He was almost more Buddhist in his logic. It was like both and, or neither nor. They're all fake, or they're all true, or they're all. But get you to the point where you had to sort of figure out your own hit on things, and that was so refreshing because the way things were being reported, there was no solution to anything. It was all just too crazy to figure. And he was like your grandfather saying, no, we can solve these problems. We can break them down and put them back together, create a whole different kind of systems thinking, which is what he was. As a naval engineer, he was trained as a systems thinker, as were other important system thinkers of that period. A couple of them were naval engineers who sort of knew the world as a whole but sailed around it. Did things as global problems, not as local problems, or even as they looked at the whole. And this goes back to Queen of the Navy during that time, and how she enlisted the pirates into the Navy so that she could defeat the Spanish. It was a whole different approach, smaller, lighter ships rather than the big battleships, Armada. In the end, even though Bucky was a military man and proud of it, he came to believe that war was absolutely obsolete. That it didn't achieve any of the purposes it was aiming to achieve. That it pretty much made every problem worse, like disease. His first daughter died of influenza and other diseases that came out of World War I, and the soldiers coming back and bringing diseases. So he was very clued into things that we're dealing with today and the breakdown of systems and the climate change and all of that. He warned us 50 years ago that we're facing the end of what he called spaceship Earth if we don't learn to run it for the good of everybody rather than in this us versus them world where most thinking and decisions were made.
Wow, that's I'm glad you touched on that. I mean, that's actually one of the things I'd like you to expand on a little bit more is his view on cooperation versus competition. And so you've already, given us, some insight about his perspective on that, but I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on it.
Well, I can actually from an interesting angle that I don't think I've talked about it a couple of times more recently in interviews, but only one maybe. Bucky loved athletics. He was blind. He couldn't hear very well, but he loved the activity of, he wore glasses, but he loved the activity of, he played football when he was a kid, and he loved athletics and sports. He was physically very active. He became a rower himself, from a young age, which is why I mentioned the rowing and the odd coincidence of that I was rowing crew when I saw him speak. But he, the sports, I think, is an interesting analysis. In the end, when it becomes about money, it becomes about competition and winning. But my dad, who became an important lawyer in California, was proud that he grew up as an Oakland playground clown, and that he played sports on the playgrounds of Oakland, which were very diverse in the 1930s, 20s and 30s, when he was growing up. And I think the playing field at its best is about competition, but it's also about cooperation. And it's also about a fair game and being a good winner as opposed to a sore loser. It's also about building a level playing field. And my dad had an amazing capability of letting good players shine, but also allowing the underdogs to get into the game and to get better. And so that idea of that the team makes everybody better, as opposed to, it rewards the good athletes and punishes and shames the bad athletes. That's not what a good playground game is about. They often self-regulate. They have a way of controlling the bullies, which I think our culture is losing its ability to do that, to really control the bullies, which are good. My dad really had a way of, whether it's in Boy Scouts or a playing field, of neutralizing the bullies and allowing the little guys into the game and showing that they had a role to play. And that's where competition and cooperation have a role. And I think some of the innovation of teachings now are not putting gifted children in a class of their own, but leaving them in class and making them teachers of younger kids. Because when you teach, you learn more. So suddenly now they're taking the gifted kids, putting them back in classes, and enlisting them as teachers of their friends, and so that the competition becomes cooperation, that there's this, and Bucky was very much into that. I mean, Bucky really believed every kid was a born genius and that they learn how to do things really quickly. They learn how to walk within a year on these unstable legs. They learn to speak a language completely foreign to them in about 2 years, and some of them get to be very good at it at a very young age. And they learn to engineer a way to the cookie jar when mother isn't looking. I mean, you must think that's what you engineer right now in your life, right?
Yes, for sure.
How to get off the bed, when they want you to stay on the bed,
Yes.
They're always exploring and defining problems and solving problems that they want to solve, like get to those cookies that they're not supposed to have before dinner, or eventually. But then we send them to school, and all independent ability to define and solve problems on their own disappears. It just goes away.
Wow.
So he believed that every child really is a born genius. It's the environment that teaches them how to be genius, so they can get along with people.
So that they can what with people? Get along with people?
Yeah, they can get along with people, so that their parents who be genius themselves 30 years before or 20 years before won't get threatened by what they're seeing and understanding.
Oh, wow. So it's almost as if the parents unconsciously want to de-genius the kids because it makes us feel more safe, and it becomes easier to parent that way.
Although parents, he would say parents play a better role than many teachers, because he was very bored at school, and he got fired out of Harvard twice, because he got bored, or one time he spent his year's allowance on a party for chorus girls, and so he'd spend all his money on a party for chorus.
Oh my goodness.
So he got fired out of Harvard and went to work at a factory, which he loved to do. He loved working at a factory because it was about real problems. It wasn't about getting the right answer to rigged and prearranged questions, which is not something he was fond of.
So he was very practical. He was less interested in the theory. He was more interested in practical implications, it sounds like.
Well, yes, but he was interested in the theories, and he had wonderful theories, but the theories had to come to the ground, and they had to be demonstrated through models, and they had to become real in people's lives. And much of his stuff is highly theoretical, and he has this whole concept of generalized principles and how we develop from these larger principles back down to solutions of the simplest problems, and how solutions can't be forced onto people, but if it's the right solution, people will almost instantly adapt it.
Wow.
So it's like you said, the first time anybody thought of building a bridge and walking across it, it's like people saw the bridge and they could get to the other side of the river. You didn't have to argue with them to cross the bridge. I mean, maybe there were superstitions or something they had to work through, but there's a bridge they can cross without getting wet or building a boat. There's a bridge, it's there. I walk across, and immediately it's used when the solution is right.
What a great example.
So he believed in design in terms of objects, but that made life easier. He also thought women were the original designers. He thought men were off hunting animals and killing things and telling war stories, and that the women stayed home and actually invented things and made things better. So he was really one of the, and partially that maybe his great aunt. He had an aunt, Margaret Fuller, who wrote a book called Women in the 19th Century, and she's one of the first great feminists. And so he came from that legacy. And Margaret Fuller was like really one of the first war reporters in the modern sense of the word. She reported on the Italian Revolution in Italy. She wrote this amazing book on women in the 19th century, and she had a front page column of the Herald Tribune in New York, and I don't think no other man had a front page column in the Herald Tribune. She was an amazing figure herself. So he came, and when you go not very far into her book on women in the 19th century, she starts to talk about the cosmos and the universe, and which is a big word for Bucky. That starting with universe and working down to the life in your own room and then around the corner in the block. I mean, he really could jump from the macrocosm to the microcosm. And that I think was part of the way he was brought up. He descended from Unitarian preachers and abolitionists, and his father was a businessman, but he said that's unusual in his family. Successful business people were a rarity in his family, but his father was one of those. But he died when Bucky was a teenager, so he kind of had to make his way after that because the family didn't have as much money as they did.
Gotcha. Great. No, thank you. Oh, very insightful. Wow. And you spoke a little about children being geniuses and then being degeniused, if you will, by school and the surroundings. And it reminds me of like children being like authentic and true to themselves. And I was wondering if you could speak about Bucky's view on being true to oneself and being authentic. And so what was his perspective on that?
Well, it was very interesting. I mean, he definitely, and I kind of got this from my parents and particularly from my older brother as well, who was a very unique person. And my parents, my dad was more of a lawyer and a philosopher and a talker, and my mom was more science, math, and my brother was the artist. And but what was big in our family, and we were raised in Berkeley, which is a unique environment in the 1950s, and it's pre-demonstrations in the 1960s, sort of hippie Berkeley, but it was an international kind of community. People came from all over the world to study at Berkeley. Oppenheimer had the physics department there. He invented the atomic bomb, but he was teaching at UC Berkeley. And you could attend UC Berkeley, one of the best universities in the world, for $25 a semester.
Oh my God. Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
And now those professional schools cost $50,000 a year. But they were basically $50 a year when my parents were going to UC Berkeley.
Wow.
And we were raised Mormon in Berkeley. And that's a very distinct breed of Mormonism, which is very much reaches back, I think, to the earliest days of Mormonism, when it had a lot to do with one's own personal testimony and one's own sort of vision of things and one's own, and that you really had to be true to yourself. And so that was something that I was raised with and then connected to with Bucky. There was almost a given in my family that we were each designed to do something with our lives, that we were positioned to do that. And Bucky reinforced that, that there is an integrity to the individual. There's a shape they're born with, and then that's modified by their environment, heavily modified often, and opened up or closed down, through an, it's like expansion and contraction are two important physical principles of Bucky. Like we breathe in and we expand. Every breath we take, we expand and contract. The tides, expand onto the shore. They contract away from the shore. I mean, those principles are all around us. But the individual, if they're constantly beaten down, they contract in fear and they can't open up to whatever's going on inside them or in the world outside of them. And that a lot of that takes a kind of relaxation. And that connects to sort of joy, and it connects to love. I mean, love is a big thing for Bucky, and the love of a mother and the love of family and the love. And then the more I worked on him, I mean, some point around 2002 or 3, and there were 600 performances of play in the first 3 years, all performed by Ron Campbell, one actor who did about 600 performances in 4 or 5 cities. From San Diego to San Francisco to Chicago to Seattle, and about about 2 years into that, I suddenly realized how important love was in his work, and that he was very much an engineer, but he was also a mystic. And For him, love was like a monkey wrench. It actually got stuff done. It wasn't something sort of generalized. It was like a kind of openness to life that would, or an energy that would create space that new ideas could move into those spaces. You know, it's like,
wow.
And it comes to what his idea of low pressure points, that, you know, you build low pressure points and things rush in, things in unpredictable ways. And so it was an engineered understanding of love. It wasn't something unrooted from physicality, or it wasn't something purely, or it wasn't something, you know, really impossible to achieve. It would actually, and oddly, when you look closely at Gandhi's work, or Martin Luther King's work, or Thich Nhat Hanh, you know, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk,
Yes.
they're also working in very difficult situations, but the principle of love opens up space and allows change. And that's a hard lesson to learn, because we all get angry and frustrated, even Bucky. I mean, he had a curmudgeon in him. Occasionally, if he thought an audience wasn't paying attention, he could get angry. But it's not the center from where he worked. I've met people who, you know, met him, sat next to him on a plane, and it was like meeting the grandfather they loved the most. It was sort of like just sitting next to him. There was this sort of energy of love that came, of curiosity. He didn't like groups because he couldn't hear very well. Well, he spoke in groups, but it was often monologue. If everybody began talking at once, he couldn't hear things because hearing aids were not very good back then. But a one-on-one, he was amazingly good. And he was very like my dad and my brother like that. When they were around kids, they were down on the rug playing with them. And he often thought his best students were 2, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, because they could understand him better than adults. You know? And there's a story his daughter taught me, that when she was sick, he would come home and they had this cardboard that would be in pressed shirts at the time. You got your shirts off and laundered and pressed at various laundries. And she grew up in New York, I think. Born in Chicago probably, but I think she grew up in New York. And apparently when she was sick, he told her a story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears and compared that to a tetrahedron, and then started teaching her about relativity at the age of 4 or 5 years old, and teaching her about the universe and the cosmos by drawing pictures on the cardboard that came out of his pressed shirts. You know, he just would recycle into drawing things. And
amazing. So resourceful. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, he was amazingly resourceful. And I think even when he lectured, I remember him looking around the room. I always think he was always looking at the way the room was structured, you know, how it was built. You always felt he was sort of rooting himself into this system of the room and how that connected to the world outside. And that's what systems thinking is. A system is like a system is is something that has an inside and an outside, and that which separates the inside from the outside. So that border, which is the skin, you know, we have inside our bodies, outside our bodies, that's a system. A room is a system. A house is a larger system. You know, your neighborhood is another kind of system, because you know when you're instinctually, you know when you're moving out of your neighborhood and into the city, you know. And so I think he constantly grounded himself in those geometric principles. So, which is where his imagination came from. And if you pay attention to the way he broke down life, you come up with a lot of interesting ideas.
Wow, that's amazing. Such a fascinating approach that he had. I love it. And you've touched a little on this as well, but maybe you could share with our audience how you know, Bucky has inspired you personally, and just what was it about him that really inspired you to want to, create this beautiful play that's, been performed across continents and so many different cities, across the world?
Well, his sort of comprehensive vision of the world, small, like our intimate world, the larger world outside, the whole globe, the whole universe. I mean, that his willingness to study everything, I think, is what inspired me. And I think to some degree, I went into theater because of that, because I realized I could probably do a play about everything, anything in theater, which is not often how it's approached in this country, but in Europe and other countries, and even in Latin America, it's a way of studying the whole world. And I think in the last 10 or 20 years, the playwriting in the US, well, really over the last 40 years, has begun to open up into a much more poetic, physical, metaphysical kind of speculation. But I think that influenced me a lot in terms of going into theater. And then at some point, I realized I was uniquely designed because of my experience with Bucky's thought and in theater that I could create a play about Bucky. I mean, it suddenly was like, I can do this in a way that not many other people can.
Oh,
and
wow.
because he was a funny guy, he was funny like my dad was. He had a sense of humor, and he had a kind of which I didn't get from seeing him lecture, but when I talked to his daughter, the first time I talked to her on the phone, it was before we did the centennial. I kind of asked him what music did he like, because I wanted to use music in the opening night ceremony. And she took a long pause and she said, well, his taste in music was not very high. He liked musical comedies, he liked music hall songs, Harry Lauder songs, beer hall songs. I mean, popular songs, Ray Bolger songs. The guy who played in Wizard of Oz, was such a wonderful singer and dancer. And he would rewrite them to his own purposes. And I said, was he a good singer? And she said, no, he had a voice like a foghorn. And everyone in his family has confirmed that. And then somehow dance came up because we had the San Diego Ballet doing something for that event. And I said, and his daughter ran the UCLA dance department for 25 years. And I kind of had known that because a woman I lived with for 5 years and helped raise her daughter, Judith, was a student at UCLA, and she was the chairman at that time. And, and so I asked her about dance, and I said, could he dance? And she goes, well, no, not really, but he loved to dance. He could be cooking a steak on the stove, and he'd be doing the little dance by the stove as he was cooking a steak. And so he loved to sing and he loved to dance, but he wasn't really very good at either of them. And, there was a pause in the conversation, and she goes, I think in his heart, he really wanted to be a song and dance man. And that's when I realized this brilliant thinker and who brought his ideas into practical artifacts and inventions was that he wanted to be a song and dance man. So I knew that's one of the points where I knew the idea of doing a play was a good idea. You get a good idea, but you have to get 2 or 3 confirmations.
Right.
But you have to somehow be told 2 or 3 times, no, this is a really good idea. And so we have him singing and dancing in the play, and we have him, cracking jokes. And, I think part of him, I think he grew up at the time of vaudeville and jokes and movies, picked that up once the talkies came in, and he watched all of that. But he was a kind of fast talker, fast walker, he was a jazz baby in a lot of ways. And so this idea that informs the play a lot, kind of wisecracking comments and here and deeply serious comments. That ability to go from the deeply serious to the comic, I think, was in very dominant in American entertainment in the 20s and 30s and 40s. You know, as from one World War to the next, I think that was an era when comedy and song and dance really thrived, and that's when he came of age. Was in that period between the two wars.
Oh, wow. Thank you. My goodness. Oh, well, I mean, you just spoke about a lot of the, inspiration, he's provided in these different areas, from intellect to even in, song and dance, like with yourself and the play and just his whole outlook. And it just really emphasizes this point that I've personally seen recently, since we've started talking about Bucky, really, I think in the last few months, where I've started to see his name just in so many different places. Yeah. It just in cosmology, like you talked about, and architecture. And I think I mentioned to you also that I was recently at the supermarket just choosing a bucket of ice cream, and the one that stood out to me the most, I was like, okay, this one looks good. It looks healthier than the other versions, and then I read one of the labels, and it said that it was inspired by the work of Buckminster Fuller. And I was like, what? How could ice cream be inspired by Bucky Fuller? And that brings me to my next question. It's just, what do you feel it is that led to Bucky's work being so inspiring to so many different people in these seemingly, distinct disciplines and different areas of life and knowledge and expertise?
Well, it's kind of astonishing, and I think it is partially his presence, and he had an odd presence, but the power of his ideas were so rooted in reality. And I mean, to figure out what words meant, he pretty much stopped talking for about 2 years, and had his wife do talking for him, and spoke to her probably a little bit when he had to, but unless he really had to speak, he wanted to figure out words, because he had a whole theory of words being tools. And so I think when you really think to the root of a problem and you talk about it, I think people feel that's different, that's new, or that's fresh, or that's old, but it's fresh. And that's the kind of recognition. He had a big influence on the computer industry. Steve Jobs was a big fan of his. I'm sure Bill Gates was influenced by him, but I don't think he talks about Bucky as much, but as Steve Jobs did. And many people will say Steve Jobs had a higher imagination than Bill Gates did, and Bill Gates had a better business mind, for utilizing these wonderful ideas that his partners came up with, and that he was bright. I mean, he's really bright, but so there's this, but he also somehow, and I tried to get this in the play, in a way, write it like a Shakespeare play or a Warner Brothers cartoon. And I think we used to be really good at this. A Warner Brothers cartoon would entertain grandparents, parents, and children and teenagers, and they'd all laugh at different jokes in a Bugs Bunny cartoon. Bugs Bunny was the greatest actor of the 20th century. He played opera. He sang opera. He played Shakespeare. He took on the Nazis. I mean, Bugs Bunny was a great character, and he was that sort of. And I think Bucky had that sort of can-do energy and confidence. Not that he didn't go through terrible things. Not that Bugs Bunny doesn't go through terrible things, but it's there's something about that ability in the 30s and 40s to create a cartoon that speaks to the whole world. And I think Bucky took that very seriously. And testimony, Americans love testimony. They love it in court. They love it in church. They love it on a podium. And they love fake testimony. if somebody can lie well, they love that, but they really love it when somebody speaks the truth, and which is often rare and rare because it's harder and harder to give it the truth. But I think Bucky had a way of speaking things that were just truth.
Mm. Wow.
Simple, a child could understand them. And adults could eventually understand them, but even his strange language, kids are not as afraid of the language of Shakespeare as adults are. We've been educated out of the joy of Shakespeare's language, where I had one student who was studying Shakespeare in Midsummer Night's Dream with his girlfriend, and they weren't following it, and suddenly her 3-4-year-old daughter explained the whole plot to the adults. Young children mainline Shakespeare because the language is powerful and energetic. And children are used to the fact that they understand most of the language around them, so that doesn't scare them about Shakespeare. So they get the music, they get the passion, they get the love, they get the emotions of it, and they get joy of it. So they figure it out.
Wow, thank you.
And Bucky had that ability Shakespeare had, or Charles Dickens, to, you could read a story and the whole family, would wrap their hearts and minds around it. And very different, but he had something, I don't know, a combination of a really good eye and a good heart and a willingness to sort of think about things before he just started talking. I think a lot of people, we reflexively start talking without thinking. Oddly, this is a funny thing, testimony, and I learned this the same year I heard Bucky speak. It was a freshman college class in history, and I learned the root of the word testimony come from testicles.
Comes from what?
Used to put our hand on the Bible, that comes from the word testicles.
Oh. Wow.
So when we testimony comes from the word testicles. So when we put our hand on the Bible to swear to the truth, in ancient Jewish days, they used to put their hands on something else to swear to the truth. And so I see Bucky as the great testifier of the 19th, 20th, and 21st century, that he's really speaking from his root and from his roots, in New England, and from his roots in the history of mankind. And he's really thinking about all of that, and he's speaking the truth. He's testifying at what he sees. And I think, as opposed to sort of joining parties, if people could really testify to what they feel, not pop on the bandwagon all the time. Sometimes that's necessary to join forces, but increasingly, as the world gets more connected, this us versus them mentality is really throwing a lot of obstacles in our path. It's really slowing us down. It's really threatening our future. This nation against that nation, and this. Because there's so much fragmentation within any nation. Somebody here may have more in common with somebody in any other country than they do with their neighbors. And we're beginning to build those connections around the globe, where that's something everybody around you hates, but you'll find a global community that shares your obsession.
So well put. Great, timely advice, especially with all the division that we see today. I know we're running low on time. I know that, you have to, we have to, end the interview shortly, and I really appreciate your time. Before we go, I was wondering if you could, tell us about how we can learn more about your work and, the different projects that you've been involved with.
Well, there's a link. I'm really kind of looking at my lack of platforms and working to build more. I have an active Facebook page, which I often write about just as a writing practice, write about politics or just share things that I think are beautiful. But and that's under Douglas W. Jacobs. My playwriting name is under D.W. Jacobs. So there is a lot of videos on YouTube that different theaters have done, and interviews with me and her daughter, and interviews, things just on her daughter, who's a wonderful dance theorist. Who, last time I really talked to her in her place in New York was, she was talking about demonstrations and marches as a form of dance. I mean, she's in her 90s, but she's very plugged into what's happening in the world, and evaluating these sort of, and very often these street demonstrations turn into dance. People are suddenly dancing, so it's that movement of a political movement has roots in dance. And
Oh, wow.
so there's some stuff on YouTube about me, and there's huge amounts about Bucky. But I am building some platforms, and probably if you connected to the buckminsterfuller.net, which is the website for the estate, there's a link that says resources, and then under that there's a link that says play, and that links to my play, and then links to some of the work we did in Poland, and I think has my email address there. So buckminsterfuller.net, then go to the resources, go to play, and there's a lot of information there. There's a huge amount of information. Like you see an ice cream, and then suddenly you see Bucky all over the world, and you never knew who he was, but he's everywhere. And you just have to notice. And it's
so true.
Those of us who worked on the play called it going down the rabbit hole. Once you go down the rabbit hole, you see a lot of strange and interesting things once you enter that world. And we've only skimmed the surface of it today. But he's also the one who points out in the play the act ends with a reference to the icosahedron, which is it's the structure of the virus, or the shell of the virus. The protein shells of all the viruses use the icosahedron structure, and he says that's why they're so strong. And so in this play, suddenly there's a reference to that comes alive. But how to find out about me, I'm going to build some platforms, but the estate's website is a good place to sort of locate it. I do have a Facebook page that's under Douglas W. Jacobs, so I'll announce some things there of work that I do. But D.W. Jacobs, which I have here, that's my playwriting name. So even if somebody searched Buckminster and Jacobs, they'd find a lot about the productions of the play that have been around the world for the last 20 years.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you so much, Doug. Is there any last nugget of wisdom that you would like to leave our audience with before?
Yeah, I did want to share something, and this is something my brother, I wanted to end with my brother. This is something my brother made. This was a Bucky-inspired Christmas ornament, but it was meant to be a kind of, and my brother was an atheist, a very strict atheist, but he made this Christmas ornament because he liked kids and he liked things that might be fascinating to kids. And it has different structured symbols from different religions built into this. So he saw this as a sort of an ecumenical holiday ornament inspired by, so this is what, when you have somebody like my brother who just pays attention to materials and objects and what they can do, you build this strange, and I think there are golden rectangle elements in this, and there are 5-pointed stars, and I think there are 6-pointed stars. There are hexagonal structures, there are pentagons, there are all kinds of shapes in this. And so just to pay attention to the world around you and materials and see what they want you to do with them, If you take toothpicks and marshmallows, you can rediscover every one of Bucky's elements. And my set designer and somebody else who helped bring the play to a theater in San Jose, his wife, I was at their house and showed some of these structures that you can build with toothpicks and marshmallows. And the next week, she was teaching them to her Girl Scout troop. So these ideas are like a good kind of virus. They sort of, kids, once you give them the right building blocks, they know what to do with them. They know how to invent things. So I think maybe to end with, trust kids more, or at least think 2 or 3 times before you get scared of their ideas or what they're trying to tell you.
Wow, such a wonderful note to end on, just about the future generations and a virus that spreads such positive inspiration. It's so timely to have that symbol and that analogy. We really need a shift of paradigm, especially in today's day and age. So thank you so much, Doug. Oh yes, go ahead.
Well, and the other thing is BFI.org is the Buckminster Fuller Institute, which is separate from the estate and the family's website, but there's a wealth of material at BFI.org. And a lot of the work of the family with BFI and BFI, has been to not turn people into little Buckies, but to recognize people who are creating models that refresh the world, that'll solve the biggest problems of the world, so it's not like become Bucky, it's become what you are designed to be, which is the integrity of each individual. So BFI.org and buckminsterfuller.net.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Doug. Really appreciate your time and sharing your wisdom and inspiration with us.
Well, thank you.
My pleasure. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you all for joining us.